The flame ate through the glossy black and white paper, curling the edges until the tiny bean-shaped image in the center turned to ash. Clara dropped the burning ultrasound into the porcelain sink, watching her secret disintegrate. The morning paper sat on her counter, its headlines screaming the truth she had been blind to. Chicago syndicate hear Dominic Russo to marry Isabella Conti in historic alliance. He was engaged. Their entire romance was a lie. She packed a single bag and vanished into the night. But you don't just walk away from the devil. 5 months later, the chime of her small-town bakery door rang. There he stood, eyes dropping to the swell of her stomach. He didn't ask. He just stepped forward, his voice a lethal whisper. "Did you really think you could burn what belongs to me?" Knob-blooded Jenkins had always known that loving Dominic Russo was like standing too close to a roaring fire. Eventually, you were going to get burned. She just hadn't expected the flames to consume her entire world in a single Tuesday morning. The day had started with a miracle. Clara sat on the edge of her clawfoot tub, staring at the small plastic wand resting on the bathroom tiles. 2 pink lines, a mixture of absolute terror and blooming warmth that flooded her chest. She was pregnant. She was carrying the child of the most feared man in Chicago's underground. Dominic was ruthless. A man who commanded the city's illicit ports and construction unions with an iron fist, but with her, in the quiet solitude of her studio apartment, he was a different man. He was the man who brought her rare books, who mapped the constellations on her bare skin, who promised her that she was the only quiet place in his chaotic world. She had practically floated to the clinic that afternoon. The doctor, a kind older woman named Dr. Aris, had smiled as she printed the grainy black-and-white ultrasound photo. 8 weeks, the doctor had said. Clara had clutched the photo to her chest, imagining the look on Dominic's face when she told him he was a man obsessed with legacy. Surely this would be the bridge that finally pulled him out of the shadows and into a real life with her. But the universe had a cruel sense of humor. On her way home, Clara stopped at a corner bodega to buy Dominic's favorite espresso beans. Waiting in line, her eyes drifted to the newspaper stand. The Chicago Tribune Society page was prominently displayed. A full-page glossy photograph stared back at her. It was Dominic. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal Tom Ford suit, his arm wrapped possessively around the waist of a stunning, dark-haired woman draped in diamonds. The headline felt like a physical blow to her ribs. A merger of empires. Dominic Russo and Isabella Conti announce winter wedding. The article detailed the historic alliance between the Russo and Conti families, an engagement that had been quietly arranged for over a year. A year. Clara's vision blurred. She had been with Dominic for 14 months. For 14 months, she had been the hidden mistress, the naive art restorer, who kept his bed warm while he planned a future, a dynasty, with a woman of his own status. Clara didn't remember walking back to her apartment. She only remembered the numb, icy realization settling over her skin. She dropped her keys on the counter. The apartment smelled of his cologne bergamot, cedar, and gunpowder. His expensive leather jacket was still draped over her armchair. She walked into the bathroom and pulled the ultrasound photo from her purse. The tiny gray mass on the paper was a child that would either be a bastard hidden away like its mother or ripped from her arms to be raised by Isabella Conti as the legitimate Russo heir. "No," Clara whispered, her voice cracking in the empty room. "Never." She opened the vanity drawer and pulled out a silver Zippo lighter one Dominic had left behind months ago. Her hands shook violently as she struck the flint. The spark caught. She held the glossy paper to the flame. It resisted for a second, then caught fire, glowing bright orange. Clara watched the fire eat away the edges, moving closer to the center, closer to the image of the life growing inside her. Tears finally spilled over her lashes, hot and fast, tracing paths down her pale cheeks. When the heat blistered her fingertips, she dropped the burning photo into the white porcelain sink. She turned on the faucet, washing the blackened ashes down the drain. She kept only a small, unburned, jagged corner of the paper blank, black, but a reminder. She tucked it into the back of her phone case. There was no time to mourn. Dominic would be coming over that night. He always came on Tuesdays. Clara moved with the frantic efficiency of a woman fighting for her life. She pulled a duffel bag from her closet. She packed no clothes that he had bought her, no jewelry he had gifted. Only her oldest jeans, heavy sweaters, and the cash she had hidden under her floorboards for emergencies, about $8,000 in small bills. She left her smartphone on the kitchen counter knowing it could be tracked. She took an old burner phone she had bought years ago when traveling. Before walking out the door, she looked around the apartment one last time. It looked exactly as it always did, save for the distinct, acrid smell of burnt paper lingering in the bathroom. She didn't leave a note. You don't negotiate with a predator. You just run. 70 miles away in the sleepy, snow-dusted town of Sycamore, Clara became Claire Winters. She paid 6 months of rent in advance in cash for a small room above a bakery called the Flower Dust. The owner, a sweet widowed woman named Martha, asked no questions when Clara offered to work the early morning shifts baking bread in exchange for a discount on rent. Sycamore was a town of quiet routines and heavy snowfalls, a place where the shadows of Chicago couldn't reach. Or so she prayed. Back in the city, the discovery of her absence had triggered an earthquake. Dominic Russo stood in the center of Clara's empty apartment, his chest heaving, his jaw clenched so tight it looked carved from granite. It was 9 p.m. on Tuesday. The apartment was dark. Her phone sat dead on the kitchen counter. Her clothes were gone. "Tear the city apart," Dominic growled, not turning his head. Behind him, Matteo Rossi, his enforcer and oldest friend, shifted uncomfortably. "Dom, the Conti family is expecting you at the gala in an hour. Isabella has been calling my phone non-stop. If you disappear tonight, her father will take it as an insult. You know what that means for the port deal." Dominic spun around, his dark eyes entirely devoid of humanity. In a flash, he crossed the room, grabbing Matteo by the lapels of his suit and slamming him against the wall. The framed painting behind Matteo shattered. "I don't give a damn about the port deal, Matteo. I don't give a damn about Isabella Conti, and I don't give a damn about her father." Dominic roared, the veins in his neck bulging. "Clara is gone. My Clara, find her. You put every man we have on the streets, at the bus stations, the airports, the train depots. You pull the city's traffic cams. You find out who helped her, and then you bring them to me so I can skin them alive." Matteo nodded slowly, raising his hands in surrender. Okay, Dom. We'll find her. She couldn't have gone far without her phone or credit cards." Dominic released him, dragging a heavy hand down his face. He paced the room, his mind racing. Why would she run? Things had been perfect. He had planned everything so carefully. The marriage to Isabella was just ink on a contract, a strategic move to merge their family's territories and pacify the old-school bosses. Isabella knew it was a sham. Dominic had intended to keep Clara exactly where she was, to protect her from the violence of his world, to shower her with everything she could ever want. He was going to buy her a brownstone in Lincoln Park. He was going to give her the world. He walked into the bathroom, looking for clues. His eyes dropped to the white porcelain sink. There, clinging to the damp ceramic, was a tiny black smudge. Ash. Dominic touched it, rubbing the gritty residue between his thumb and forefinger. He lifted it to his nose. It smelled like burnt paper. But she hadn't taken any files. She had no documents to destroy. What had she burned? Days turned into weeks. Weeks bled into months. The Chicago syndicate whispered that Dominic Russo had lost his mind. He attended the mandatory meetings and posed for the paparazzi with Isabella, but he was a ghost. He was brutal, unforgiving, ordering executions for the slightest infractions. The city bled because its king was bleeding. Matteo hunted relentlessly. He tracked Clara's movement to a train station, but she had brilliantly bought 3 separate tickets to 3 different states in cash and boarded none of them, slipping onto a local commuter bus instead. She was a ghost. But ghosts eventually have to interact with the living. In Sycamore, Clara was 22 weeks pregnant. Her belly had popped, a distinct, undeniable curve that she tried to hide beneath oversized, flour-dusted aprons. The baby kicked frequently, strong and lively, a constant, beautiful reminder of the terror she was running from. She lived a small, paranoid life. She didn't use banks. She didn't drive. She walked to the local clinic under the name Claire Winters and paid in cash. But Clara made one single mistake. It happened in the middle of November. A severe winter storm was rolling in, and Martha had asked Clara to run down to the local pharmacy to pick up her heart medication. Clara had braved the blizzard, wrapped in a thick wool scarf, her face mostly hidden. As she stood at the pharmacy counter, a woman in front of her collapsed, seizing on the floor. Clara, acting on pure instinct, dropped her knees. "Call 911, she yelled to the pharmacist. She rolled the woman onto her side, cradling her head to protect it from the linoleum floor. When the paramedics arrived, the local police officer taking the report asked for Clara's name as a witness. Flustered, adrenaline rushing through her veins, Clara's brain misfired. "Clara," she stammered, before catching herself. Claire. Claire Winters." The officer, a rookie named Miller, typed it into his tablet. "Clara or Claire, ma'am. Do you have an ID?" I left it at the bakery. "It's Claire Winters. I was startled. The officer let it go, noting her as Claire Winters. But the name Clara was entered into the incident report narrative. 2 days later, 300 miles away in a dark office in Chicago, a piece of surveillance software pinged. Matteo had set an algorithm to flag the name Clara in any police or medical databases within a 500-mile radius. It produced thousands of false positives every week. A dedicated team of hackers sifted through them. "Boss," a young hacker called out, his voice trembling as he looked at Matteo. "I got a partial match, an incident report from a pharmacy in Sycamore, Illinois. Witness gave the name Clara, then corrected it to Claire Winters. No ID provided." Matteo warped over, looking at the screen. "Pull the pharmacy's security feed." I did. "It's low quality, but..." The hacker clicked a button. The grainy footage played, a woman wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf kneeling on the floor. As the paramedics arrived, the woman stood up, pulling the scarf down to catch her breath. The camera caught her profile. Matteo's breath hitched. He immediately picked up his phone and dialed Dominic. "Dom," Matteo said softly, "we found her." The bell above the flour dust door jingled, signaling the arrival of a customer. Clara wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron, blowing a stray strand of hair out of her eyes. It was 8 p.m., a full hour past closing time. She had left the door unlocked because Martha was supposed to be coming by to pick up the week's receipts. "Sorry, Martha, I'm just finishing wiping down the counters," Clara called out from the back kitchen, grabbing a damp rag. "I left the envelope on the register." Silence answered her. A prickle of unease washed over the back of Clara's neck. The hair on her arm stood up. She stopped moving. The bakery was completely silent, save for the hum of the industrial refrigerator. But the air in the room had shifted. It felt heavier, colder. She took a slow, hesitant step out from the kitchen area, peeking into the dimly lit storefront. A man stood in the shadows by the door. He was wearing a bespoke black cashmere overcoat over a dark suit. The street lights outside cast long, ominous shadows across the floor, illuminating the polished leather of his shoes. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, an apex predator perfectly still, watching her. The rag slipped from Clara's numb fingers, hitting the floor with a soft slap. Dominic stepped out of the shadows. Clara stopped breathing. The world spun violently on its axis. He looked older, harsher. The sharp planes of his face were hollowed out, his dark stubble thicker than usual. But his eyes, those pitch-black, bottomless eyes, were exactly the same, burning with a mix of fury, relief, and a terrifying, consuming obsession. "Hello, Clara," Dominic said. His voice was a low rumble, smooth as velvet and sharp as broken glass. Clara stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the pastry display case. Her hands instinctively flew to her swollen stomach, a desperate protective gesture. "How?" Her voice was a pathetic, breathless squeak. "How did you find me?" Dominic didn't answer immediately. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. He locked the bakery door behind him and flipped the deadbolt. The metallic click sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. You changed your hair, he noted, his gaze trailing over her darker shoulder-length cut. You're wearing cheap clothes. You work in a bakery. He took another step, closing the distance between them. The scent of bergamot, cedar, and cold winter air washed over her, making her knees weak. You threw away everything I gave you. You disappeared into thin air. Dominic, please, Clara whispered, pressing her back against the glass case. Don't do this. Let me go. Let you go? The words ripped from his throat in a sudden violent snarl. In a fraction of a second, he crossed the remaining distance, his large hands slamming onto the glass case on either side of her, trapping her in his cage. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his breath hot against her cheek. I have ripped this state apart with my bare hands looking for you. I have bled men dry to find out where you went, and you ask me to let you go? Clara squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away, tears instantly springing to her eyes. You're getting married, Dominic. You chose Isabella. You made your choice. Isabella is a business transaction. He roared, the sheer volume rattling the pastry trays. She is a signature on a piece of paper. You are my soul. You are my heart. You do not get to decide that we are over. You belong to me. I am not your property. Clara shoved at his chest, but he felt like a brick wall. I'm not going to be your secret whore while you play king with your Mafia princess. I won't let my child grow up like that. Dominic froze. The absolute stillness that overtook him was more terrifying than his yelling. Slowly, excruciatingly, his gaze dropped from her tear-streaked face, down to the oversized apron, down to her hands which were still fiercely guarding the pronounced, unmistakable curve of her belly. Clara saw the exact moment his brain processed the information. He stopped breathing, the color drained from his face, leaving him pale in the dim light. His large, calloused hand trembled as he slowly lifted it from the glass case. He reached out, his fingertips grazing the fabric of her apron right over her stomach. Clara flinched, but she was trapped. A child, Dominic whispered, his voice entirely devoid of its previous rage. It was raw, stunned, awestruck. At that exact moment, as if sensing the emotional hurricane outside, the baby delivered a sharp, distinct kick right where Dominic's hand hovered. Dominic gasped. A physical shudder wrecked his massive frame. He dropped to his knees right there on the flour-dusted floor of the bakery. He pressed both of his hands fully against her stomach, leaning his forehead against her chest. Mine, he breathed out, the words sounding like a religious prayer. You're carrying my child. Dominic, stop, Clara sobbed, trying to step away, but his grip on her waist tightened, anchoring her to him. He slowly looked up at her, still on his knees. The ruthless Mafia boss, the monster of Chicago, looked utterly wrecked. Then his eyes hardened, a terrifying piece of the puzzle falling into place. The sink, he said, his voice dropping to a lethal, dangerous whisper. Clara froze. Dominic stood up slowly, towering over her once again. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small plastic evidence bag. Inside it was a tiny, jagged, half-burned piece of glossy black paper. The corner of the ultrasound. I found this in the sink, Dominic said, holding it up. His eyes bored into hers, a terrifying mix of betrayal and possessive fury. I took it to a specialist. They told me it was the corner of a sonogram. He stepped closer, his chest pressing against hers, his voice dropping to a dark, vibrating frequency that shook her to her core. You knew, he snarled softly. You knew you were pregnant with my heir, and you tried to burn the evidence. You tried to steal my blood from me. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the back of her neck, his thumb resting gently yet firmly against her jaw. He leaned in until his lips brushed against her ear. You burned the first one, Mia Luce, he whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple. But this in here, it's mine, and you will never, ever run from me again. The ride back to Chicago was a blur of oppressive silence and the low hum of a bulletproof Cadillac Escalade speeding down I-88. Clara sat pressed against the furthest edge of the leather seat, her arms wrapped protectively around her swollen belly. The heater was on, blowing warm air that smelled faintly of expensive leather and Dominic's cedar cologne, but she had never felt colder. Dominic sat beside her, perfectly still, his massive frame taking up entirely too much space in the cabin. He didn't touch her, but his eyes never left her. They were fixed on the curve of her stomach, tracking the slight, sporadic movements of the baby, kicking beneath her wool sweater. Every time the baby moved, a dark, dangerous reverence flashed across Dominic's face. Matteo drove in total silence, the glass partition between the front and back raised, sealing Clara inside a moving vault with the man she had desperately tried to escape. "You can't do this," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse from crying in the bakery. The neon lights of the Chicago skyline had just breached the horizon, a glowing cage rising to swallow her whole. "Kidnapping is a federal offense, Dominic. Even you can't buy your way out of that." Dominic turned his gaze slowly from her stomach to her face. The raw vulnerability she had seen in the bakery was gone, replaced by the chilling, calculating mask of the syndicate boss. "You are my family, Clara. A man bringing his pregnant woman home is not a kidnapping. It's an obligation. I'm not your woman," she snapped, a spark of defiance breaking through her terror. "Isabella Conti is your woman. You chose the alliance. You chose the power. I am just a secret you want to lock in a closet." Dominic shifted, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. Before she could shrink away, his large hand gently grasped her chin, holding her firmly in place. His thumb stroked her cheekbone, the touch agonizingly soft compared to the lethal promise in his eyes. "Isabella is a signature on a piece of paper. She is a political maneuver to keep the old families from tearing the ports apart. But this," he dropped his other hand to rest firmly, possessively over her womb, "is my blood. This is my legacy. Did you really believe I would let my child be raised in some pathetic, freezing small town by a baker?" "I believed you would ruin us," she choked out, a tear slipping down her face, wetting his thumb. "I will burn this city to the bedrock before I let anything happen to you or this child," he vowed, his voice a low, vibrating hum that settled deep in her bones. "But you will never run from me again. If you try, I will bury anyone who helps you. Understand?" Clara closed her eyes, the terrifying reality of her situation setting in. She was trapped. Instead of her old familiar studio apartment, Matteo drove them to the exclusive St. Regis Chicago. The SUV bypassed the main entrance, slipping into a subterranean, highly secure private garage. Clara was escorted by Dominic and 3 heavily armed guardsmen with broad shoulders and earpieces, one of whom Dominic addressed as Griffin Up, a private elevator that required retinal scans. The penthouse took up the entire top floor. It was a sprawling masterpiece of dark marble, brushed steel, and floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass overlooking Lake Michigan. It was breathtaking, expensive, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a high-altitude prison. For the next 4 weeks, Clara was a prisoner in the sky. Dominic spared no expense. A private chef prepared all her meals, strictly following a prenatal diet. A renowned obstetrician, Dr. Aris, the very woman who had handed Clara that first ultrasound, was brought to the penthouse weekly under heavy guard. Dr. Aris looked terrified, checking Clara's blood pressure with shaking hands while Dominic stood over her shoulder, watching every move like a hawk. Dominic was home every night. He would return from his business, smelling of cigar smoke and sometimes copper, strip off his suit and climb into the massive king-sized bed. He would pull Clara back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her waist, his hands resting heavily on her stomach until he felt the baby move. Only then would his breathing even out. He was obsessed, tethered to the life growing inside her, yet completely ignoring the emotional death Clara was experiencing. The television was strictly monitored, but Clara wasn't stupid. She managed to snatch a glance at Matteo's tablet one afternoon when he left it on the kitchen island. The headline made her blood run cold. Russo Conti wedding approaches, a royal winter gala set for December 20th. It was the second week of December. He was still marrying Isabella. He was keeping his Mafia princess for the public and locking the mother of his child in a tower. The betrayal reignited the fire in Clara's chest. Running hadn't worked. Hiding hadn't worked. If she was going to survive this, if her child was going to have a real life, she had to play a much more dangerous game. She had to fight back from the inside. Clara's opportunity arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks before Dominic's scheduled wedding. A massive shipment crisis had erupted at the Southside docks. Dominic had been pacing the penthouse on the phone since 4 a.m., screaming in rapid-fire Italian. By 6 a.m., he had kissed Clara's forehead, ordered Griffin to double the door guards, and left with Matteo and his primary security detail. The penthouse was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the study. Clara was sitting by the window watching the snow fall over the lake, mapping out the security camera blind spots she had memorized over the past month. At 10:30 a.m., the private elevator chimed. Clara frowned. The chef had already come and gone, and Dr. Aris wasn't due until Friday. She stood up, walking cautiously toward the foyer. Griffin was standing by the mahogany front doors, his hand resting instinctively on the holster at his hip. The elevator doors slid open. Stepping out was a vision of terrifying, flawless elegance. Isabella Conti wore a white cashmere coat draped over a tailored crimson dress. Her dark hair was slicked back, her red lips curved into a sharp, condescending smile. Flanking her were 2 men who looked less like bodyguards and more like executioners. Griffin, Isabella purred, her voice a smooth, cultured drawl. "Stand down. I'm here to see the new addition to the Russo portfolio." Griffin blocked the doorway, his jaw tight. "Miss Conti, Mr. Russo did not authorize any visitors. I cannot let you inside." Isabella laughed, a dry, humorless sound. She stepped closer to the guard. "I am Dominic's fiancée. In 14 days, I am the boss's wife. If you think a rented muscle is going to keep me out of my future husband's property, you'll find yourself floating in the Chicago River by midnight. Move." Griffin hesitated. In the hierarchy of the syndicate, defying a Conti was a death sentence. He stepped aside, his eyes avoiding Clara's. Isabella strode into the penthouse, her stiletto heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. She stopped a few feet away from Clara, her sharp eyes performing a slow, brutal assessment. They lingered on Clara's plain maternity clothes, the lack of makeup, and finally, the undeniable heavy curve of her stomach. "So," Isabella said, tilting her head, "the rumors in the underground are true. Dominic didn't just lose his mind over a stray. He lost it over a stray with a parasite." "Get out," Clara said, her voice shaking, though she forced herself to stand tall. "You don't belong here." "I don't belong here." Isabella sneered, walking over to the kitchen island and dragging a finger across the pristine granite. "I belong exactly where Arthur Conti tells me to belong. Our families have bled for a century, Clara. This marriage is the peace treaty. Do you have any idea how delicate that treaty is?" "I don't care about your Mafia politics," Clara retorted, taking a protective step back. "I didn't ask for any of this. I tried to leave." "Moke." "I know," Isabella said, her tone suddenly dropping the theatrical hostility, replacing it with a cold, terrifying pragmatism. She waved her hand and her 2 guards stepped back toward the elevator, giving them the illusion of privacy. "I know you ran. I know Dominic tore up half the Midwest looking for you. And I know that as long as you and that bastard child are breathing, my position as the Russo matriarch is threatened." Clara's breath hitched. "Are you threatening to kill us?" "I am stating a fact," Isabella corrected smoothly. "My father, Arthur, is an old-school man. He believes in bloodlines. He knows about you, Clara. I told him this morning. Right now, he is weighing whether it is cleaner to let Dominic have his little side piece, or if a rogue heir is too much of a liability to the Conti-Russo dynasty." Isabella took a step closer, lowering her voice. "My father will kill you, Clara. He will wait until Dominic is distracted, and he will erase you and that baby. Dominic cannot protect you from the entire syndicate. Not forever." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The walls of the penthouse felt like they were closing in. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Isabella smiled thinly, "I despise Dominic Russo. He is a brute, and I have my own lover waiting in the wings. But I want the power that comes with the Russo name. I want the throne. I don't want a war with my father, and I don't want a war with Dominic. Isabella reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, unmarked brown envelope, tossing it onto the kitchen counter. It landed with a heavy thud. Inside is a new passport, a sterilized phone, and $200,000 in untraceable bearer bonds, Isabella said. There is a private jet waiting at O'Hare, under a shell corporation. It will take you to Switzerland. You will vanish. Dominic will assume my father had you taken, which will start the war anyway, but you will be alive, and your child will be safe. Clara stared at the envelope. It was everything she had tried to do herself, handed to her on a silver platter by the woman she was supposed to hate. Why should I trust you? Clara whispered. How do I know this isn't a trap to get me out of the building so your father's men can shoot me in an alley? You don't, Isabella said bluntly, but you know for a fact that if you stay in this glass cage, you are a sitting duck. The clock is ticking, Clara. You have until tonight to decide. Heap the envelope. Before Clara could respond, the heavy mahogany front doors slammed open with the force of a bomb detonating. Dominic stood in the doorway, breathless, his dark suit rumpled, his eyes blazing with a demonic, unhinged fury. He held a custom Glock 19 in his right hand, the safety off, pointed directly at the floor. Matteo and 3 other men flooded into the room behind him, weapons drawn. Griffin was already bleeding from a split lip where Dominic had backhanded him. Isabella, Dominic snarled, stepping into the penthouse, the sheer force of his presence sucking all the oxygen from the room. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't put a bullet between your eyes right now. Isabella didn't flinch. She slowly turned to face her fiancé, a cold, mocking smile on her lips. Because, darling, if you kill me, my father's men will level this building with a rocket launcher, and your precious little baker will burn with it. Put the gun away, Dominic. We need to talk. The silence that followed Isabella's words was thick enough to choke on. The air in the penthouse crackled with a lethal static electricity. Dominic's finger hovered over the trigger of his Glock, the veins in his forearms straining against his tailored sleeves. For a terrifying, suspended moment, Clara thought he was actually going to pull the trigger. She could see the violent calculation behind his pitch-black eyes, weighing the cost of a war against the sheer satisfaction of painting the marble floors with Isabella's blood. Put the gun down, Dom, Matteo cautioned softly from the doorway, his own weapon still trained on Isabella's guards. She's not worth the blowback, not today. Slowly, agonizingly, Dominic lowered the weapon. But the murderous intent radiating from him didn't dissipate, it sharpened. He closed the distance between himself and Isabella until his chest nearly brushed hers. When he spoke, his voice was a terrifying guttural whisper that seemed to echo from the deepest pits of hell. If your father so much as looks in the direction of my building, Isabella, I will not just kill him. I will butcher every single member of the Conti bloodline from Chicago to Palermo. I will burn your family's legacy to the ground and salt the earth. Do you understand me? Isabella's smirk faltered, a genuine flicker of fear breaking through her icy facade. She swallowed hard, taking a calculated step backward toward the elevator. You're letting a stray dog ruin an empire, Dominic. When the commission finds out about this, you'll be standing alone. I am the empire, Dominic snarled. Get out of my home. Isabella didn't say another word. She signaled her men, and the 3 of them backed into the private elevator. The brushed steel doors slid shut, sealing them away. The moment they were gone, the violent energy in the room shattered. Dominic turned his ferocious gaze to Clara, his chest heaving. His eyes instantly zeroed in on the thick, unmarked brown envelope sitting on the kitchen island. He moved toward it like a predator stalking wounded prey. He snatched the envelope, tearing it open. The contents spilled onto the granite counter, a dark blue forged passport, a burner phone, and a stack of bearer bonds from Crestwood Financial worth $200,000. A flight itinerary from Vanguard Aviation at O'Hare fluttered to the floor, detailing a private, untraceable flight to Geneva, Switzerland. Dominic stared at the documents, his face draining of color. The rage that had been directed at Isabella suddenly shifted, morphing into a raw, agonizing betrayal. He looked up at Clara, his eyes wide and hollow. Were you going to take it? His voice cracked, stripping away the Mafia boss and leaving only a terrified man. Were you going to take her money and disappear again? Clara's heart shattered at the look on his face, but she refused to cower. She stood her ground, resting both hands protectively over her stomach. She gave it to me 5 seconds before you walked through that door, Dominic. I didn't ask for it, but you want to know the truth. Dominic flinched but didn't speak. The truth is, Clara said, her voice trembling but resolute, Isabella was right. Your cage isn't bulletproof. You can lock me in this penthouse. You can surround me with guards, but Arthur Conti is a ghost. He will find a way in. He will wait until you're at the docks or in a meeting, and he will kill me and your child to protect his daughter's throne. You are trying to build a family inside a burning house. Dominic stared at her, the reality of her words hitting him like physical blows. He looked at the fake passport, then at the heavy curve of her belly. For the first time since he had dragged her back from Sycamore, Clara saw the absolute crushing weight of his reality settle onto his shoulders. He couldn't have both. He couldn't keep the peace with the old families and keep the woman he loved. Matteo, Dominic said, his voice suddenly eerily calm, devoid of all emotion. Matteo stepped forward. Yeah, Dom? Pull every man we have, empty the armories. I want full surveillance on Arthur Conti, his capos and his lieutenants. Ground all their private flights, freeze the port shipments. Dominic turned to look out the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring down at the sprawling, icy city of Chicago. We're going to war. Dominic, wait. Clara stepped forward, grabbing his arm. His muscles were tight as coiled steel under her hands. If you strike first, the commission the other families, they'll turn on you. Isabella said she wants the empire without the blood. She has a lover, someone in the shadows she's planning to replace you with, once she has the Russo name. Dominic froze, his dark eyes snapping back to hers. A lover? She slipped, Clara explained, her mind racing. She said she despised you, that she had her own man waiting in the wings, and she wanted the power without the war. Dominic, she's not just playing you. She's playing her father, too. If you just attack Arthur, Isabella wins. Dominic looked at Matteo, a dark, brilliant realization dawning between the two men. Find out who Isabella has been seeing, Dominic ordered, his voice dropping an octave. Check offshore accounts, check hotel registries at the Peninsula and the Waldorf. Check her encrypted comms. If she's plotting to overthrow her own father and me, we don't need to start a war. We just need to let the rats eat each other. For the next 10 days, the penthouse transformed from a prison into a war room. Clara was no longer a captive. She was an active participant. She sat with Matteo's hackers, bringing them coffee and reviewing Isabella's social schedules, looking for discrepancies. 2 days before the wedding, they found him. His name was Richard Caldwell. He wasn't a mobster. He was a high-ranking deputy U.S. attorney. The betrayal was staggering in its scope. Isabella had been feeding Caldwell federal evidence against her own father and Dominic's lieutenants. The plan was flawless. She would marry Dominic, securing the Russo assets. A month later, Caldwell would launch a massive federal RICO indictment, sweeping up Arthur Conti and Dominic Russo, locking them away for life. Isabella would be left as the untouchable, grieving wife, controlling the entire Chicago syndicate with a federal prosecutor in her bed. Dominic looked at the wiretap transcripts Matteo had printed, a dark, lethal smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of the devil, realizing he had been invited to dinner. She thinks she can outplay me, Dominic whispered, trailing a finger over the name Richard Caldwell on the paper. He looked up at Clara, his eyes burning with a terrifying devotion. Pack a bag, Maya Luce. We're getting you out of the city. The evening of December 20th was a masterclass in deception. A historic blizzard had descended upon Chicago, burying the city in 2 feet of snow. But it didn't stop the elite from descending upon the Palmer House Hilton for the wedding of the decade. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of winter opulence. Crystal chandeliers dripped with imported white orchids. The guest list was a who's who of corrupt politicians, dirty judges, and the most dangerous men in the North American underground. At the front of the room, standing beside the altar, was Dominic. He wore a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, looking every inch the ruthless, untouchable king of the syndicate. But his mind was 150 miles away. Deep in the snow-covered woods of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, Clara sat by a roaring fireplace in a heavily fortified private cabin. Mateo and a dozen of Dominic's most lethal, trusted men surrounded the property. Clara held her burner phone tight in her hands, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The baby kicked, sensing her surging adrenaline. Back in the ballroom, the string quartet began to play a haunting rendition of Schubert's Ave Maria. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. Isabella Conti looked breathtaking. She wore a custom Vera Wang gown, heavily encrusted with diamonds, a sheer veil covering her face. Her father, Arthur Conti, walked her down the aisle. He looked smug, radiating the arrogance of a man who believed he had finally chained the Russo beast to his family's chariot. Isabella reached the altar. Arthur placed her hand in Dominic's. Dominic's grip was firm, cold, and entirely devoid of affection. The Archbishop paid a fortune to look the other way on their sins, began the ceremony. He spoke in Latin, his voice echoing over the silent, expectant crowd. If anyone objects to this union, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. I object, Dominic said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the cavernous ballroom like a scythe. The Archbishop blinked, confused. A murmur rippled through the crowd of 400 guests. Isabella's head snapped up, her dark eyes flashing with sudden, panicked confusion behind her veil. Arthur Conti, sitting in the front row, stiffened, his hand instinctively dropping toward the inside of his tailored jacket. Dominic released Isabella's hand, taking a deliberate step back. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a small black remote. He pressed a button. Instantly, the massive 30-foot projector screens flanking the ballroom intended for a slideshow of the couple dropped from the ceiling. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The screens flickered to life. The first image was a high-resolution photograph of Isabella Conti entering a private suite at the Waldorf with U.S. Attorney Richard Caldwell. The second was a snapshot of offshore bank transfers from Conti's shell companies to Caldwell's sister's account. But the final nail in the coffin was the audio. The speakers that had been playing Ave Maria suddenly crackled, broadcasting a crystal-clear recording of Isabella's voice. My father is an old fool, Richard, and Dominic is a brute who thinks with his fists. Once the ring is on my finger, you drop the RICO indictment. They'll both be at Florence ADX before spring, and I'll hand you the union contracts on a silver platter. We take it all. The ballroom erupted into absolute pandemonic chaos. Arthur Conti's face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't look at Dominic. He looked at his daughter. You treacherous bitch, he roared, drawing a silver 1911 pistol from his coat, aiming it directly at Isabella. Before Arthur could pull the trigger, the sound of 3 suppressed gunshots echoed rapidly through the room. Pff, pff, psh. Arthur Conti's eyes went blank. He collapsed to the marble floor, dead before he hit the ground. Riffin, who had been standing in the shadows behind the Conti patriarch, lowered his smoking weapon, stepping smoothly into Dominic's ranks. Isabella screamed, dropping to her knees, her pristine white dress soaking up the pooling blood of her father. She looked up at Dominic, her face pale with terror. Dominic looked down at her with the cold, detached gaze of a god, judging an insect. The doors to the ballroom burst open, but it wasn't the police. It was the commission, the heads of the 5 other families, men Dominic had privately met with the night before, presenting the same evidence. The Conti family is compromised, Dominic announced, his voice booming over the terrified whispers of the crowd. They conspired with the federal government to destroy the syndicate. By the laws of our fathers, their territory, their ports, and their assets are forfeit. They belong to the Russo family now. The heads of the commission nodded in silent agreement. The transition of power was sealed in blood. Dominic didn't stay for the cleanup. He tossed the remote onto Isabella's lap, turned his back on the screaming woman, and walked out the side door into the freezing Chicago night. Clara jumped as the sound of heavy helicopter blades cut through the quiet, snowy night in Lake Geneva. She stood up from the leather sofa, her breath catching in her throat as the front door of the cabin opened. The freezing wind whipped through the room, carrying with it the scent of pine, jet fuel, and the metallic tang of blood. Dominic stood in the doorway. He was out of breath, his tuxedo jacket missing, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and speckled with tiny, terrifying drops of crimson. He looked exhausted, brutal, and entirely triumphant. He closed the door, locking the cold out. He walked slowly across the rustic cabin floor, his eyes locked onto Clara. When he reached her, he didn't grab her. He didn't issue a command. Instead, the ruthless king of the new Chicago syndicate dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor. He wrapped his massive arms around her hips, burying his face in the soft wool of her sweater, right against her swollen belly. Clara let out a choked sob, her hands coming down to tangle in his thick, dark hair. "It's done," Dominic whispered roughly, his voice vibrating against her skin. "Arthur is dead. Isabella is banished to the Commission's custody. There is no one left to threaten you. No one left to hide from." He tilted his head back, looking up at her with eyes that were no longer completely pitch black, but softened by a desperate, consuming love. "I burned the old world down, Clara," he vowed, his thumb gently stroking the side of her stomach. "I burned it down to ashes, and from those ashes I built a kingdom that is completely unconditionally yours." Clara smiled through her tears, finally leaning down to press her lips to his. He tasted like cold winter, an absolute victory. She wasn't a prisoner anymore. She was the queen of the ashes. "Good," Clara whispered against his mouth, her hand resting over his heart. "Because our baby is going to need a very big yard." Wow, what a roller coaster of a story. From Clara's desperate escape and the heartbreaking burning of that ultrasound to the ultimate explosive showdown at the wedding. This Mafia romance had us holding our breath until the very last second. Dominic proved that true love isn't just about protecting the one you care for, it's about burning down any world that tries to tear you apart. If you loved the intense drama, the jaw-dropping twists, and that satisfying boss-level revenge, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like button to let us know you enjoyed the ride. Share this video with your fellow romance and drama lovers, and hit that subscribe bell so you never miss another thrilling story from our channel. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you found that envelope? See you in the next one.